Okay, well, welcome back. We're now in the demonstration portion for day 2, and so I'm going to be going over pretty much everything that I covered in the presentation material earlier this afternoon. So to get started, let's just start work. So we have a folder here that we've already gotten together, day 2, and this initial project that we're going to be loading from yesterday is in 1-initial. So we grab this SMS base project and then pull it right into the interface, and then we should be able to see where we left off yesterday. And so essentially we've got all of our data sets and our merged final product here. So in the PowerPoint, I think all of these were closed. It doesn't matter. This just kind of frees up some space if you have a lot of things in the data tree. That way you don't have to see them. You can shrink these a little bit by using the plus and minuses. But what we want to do is just get rid of everything that we're not going to be using today. So I'm selecting the first and then holding the shift key down, then selecting the last, and then I can choose the delete key. It removes them, and then I'm ready to go. Essentially, everything that we did yesterday is all represented here in this merged all data set. So what we need to do now is to start and create different coverages for the different things that we're going to be working with. And so what we do is under map data, we right click and choose a new coverage. And the first one we can do is going to do CMS flow boundary conditions. So we choose that, we can give it a new name if we'd like, and then click OK. So you see it pops up over here, and we're ready to select a couple of others. So we also need to create a Quadtree Generator coverage, and also an activity classification coverage. So those are the 3 types we normally use. There's another one for save points. We can get into that later during our advanced course the end of the summer. But for right now, this is where we're going to start. So these 3 coverages. So as I mentioned earlier, you want to see pieces of these while we're actually in the other coverages, and so one of the things you can do is to change your display options. So that's this button here, or you could choose under display options. There's several ways to get to it, but basically in this map module to turn on the inactive coverage. Once you do that, then you'll be able to see some of the items from the other coverages. All right. So the next thing we can do is to create, through the Quadtree Generator, we wanted to specify where our domain is going to be. And so what we can do is to select the Quadtree Generator, and then a tool will be available to create a 2D grid frame. So we'll click that, and I'll zoom in a little bit so that we can see the area that we're going to be working with, and that way we can define our area. And so you don't have to be exact here. You're able to move this around and change it up. So you just click out 3 points to define your area. So you can start offshore and move onshore, start onshore and move offshore, whatever you want to do. Let's just start offshore in this case, and you see I can go anywhere with this, but once I click the second time it locks that in, and then I can click a third time to define my area. We only see part of it. There's a grid frame out here, but these contours are overlapping and they're covering it up. So what we can do is come back into our display options, go under scatter, and change our contours. So we'll add some transparency of, I'll put 35% for right now, and you see it lightens that up, but now we can see the actual extents of our grid frame. So I'll choose to select this tool and select it there. And once I select it, I have the ability to change the size based on these handles. So there's one at every corner and one at every midpoint of the edges. And there's also a rotate tool down here where you can change this orientation a little bit. So if you're not sure what the orientation should be, you can just move your grid frame to match the shoreline, and then you're able to maybe match that a little bit better, and then come back and add the area that you want to be working with. So I'll just change this a little bit. I'm not exactly sure what the area is that I want to create, but this is approximate. We can come back in and modify this a little bit later on. In the dialogue or the presentation, I kind of wrote down some numbers, and I'll probably go back and use that. But for now, you can just play around with this, get this approximate. You want to have a significant amount of room on the lateral edges to where you're not interfering if there are any lateral issues on your boundary, that it does not affect your inlet. And so you just want enough distance there. It doesn't have to be this large. It could be a little bit smaller depending on what you want. Same thing offshore. So you want to know about where the ebb jet finishes as it's flowing out. And in some locations you have a pretty defined ebb shoal that kind of tells you, okay, this is the extent of where the ebb jet comes, and then once it dissipates, it dumps the material right there. So we don't have that really in this condition, in this case, so we'll just kind of keep working around with this. So I will go in and show you real quick. You can double click this centerpiece and bring up the grid frame properties. If you wanted to, you can right click on it as well and get properties, but either one works. And this is where you can enter those values that we want to use. So I'm just going to go ahead and enter the same values from before. So I'm using 186, 200 and 145, 780, and that's basically defining where this origin is. You see this IJ, they call this a triad. So this means that this corner is the point of origin, and for all CMS flow grids, that's always in the lower left-hand corner. It doesn't matter how you draw the points out or the angles or anything. If the angle becomes too great, I'll just show you an example. If for whatever reason this angle becomes something like this, then it's always still in the lower left-hand corner. So the same thing here. Now let's move to that location. So it just depends on the area and how you have it set up. So I'm just going to again go ahead and enter the values that I want to use for this. We're using 347 for the angle, and then on the IJ offset we're going to use 7630 and 11100. And don't worry about anything down here, we'll be modifying this later. So when we click OK, we're going to see that change and we actually get the same shape. So it's a quick way to reproduce a grid. So later on we're going to be doing this, and we want to create another one really quick. Let me just do this just real quick again. What you can do is just create a grid with 3 points really quick, double click in here and then enter these values, and then that's all you really need to do. You don't need to spend a whole lot of time. And there we have our exact grid frame again. So don't worry about spending a whole lot of time later on when we want to recreate this grid, and I'll get into why we do that later. So the next thing that we will want to do, we're done with this for right now, so let's go into the activity classification. And so we're going to choose that. And so this is kind of where you would want to start seeing where your land-water interface is going to be. Right now, we have some bathymetry. It's not the best, but it's probably good enough to give us a good shoreline, maybe. So let's right-click on Merged All on this scatter data, and then choose to convert the scatter contours to map. And basically what it's going to do is wherever it sees a 0 elevation or whatever value we put here, it's going to create an arc that coincides with that. And right now we have it set to activity classification. We could change that if we needed to, but it's right, so we're going to just leave that and click OK. And so it's created this arc for my area, and it looks pretty decent. That's because when we initially created this data that we're working with, we had a defined contour data set that had the shape that we were going to end up using. And so it kind of already had that. That was that negative 0.75 meter contour. And so, you know, that's kind of showing that. But occasionally there may be some arcs or things that we may not want. So let me see if I can find a couple of those areas at a different section of the grid that's more coarse bathymetry. And so this will kind of be, we'll use this as an example. So what we would want to do is to clean this up a little bit. So let's change our tool to a select arc. And I can just select this arc, and I'll select a few. So I'm holding down my shift key, and then I'm selecting additional arcs that I want to get rid of, that I don't think adequately reflect my shoreline. And so I'm going to keep working. I'm not going to do this for very long, but I just wanted to give you a good idea. All right, and I mentioned earlier that if you wanted to pan, you can let up off your shift key, hold down your F2 key, and your cursor now becomes a hand instead of a pointer, and you can drag and change this. So now back with the shift key, I'll go back and delete a few other things. Excuse me. And so you just keep moving around and doing this and cleaning up the area. So delete these arcs, and they're gone, and that would represent. What we have already is pretty decent, and so I'm probably going to just use this for now. There are a couple of other things that you could do if you wanted to. So I'll just remove that one arc real quick. So that shows you how to use that scatter contours to feature points, feature arcs tool. So another thing that we covered in the lesson was the cusp data set, or the cusp coastline database. And so what I'm going to do now is to just grab that and go to that in my browser. I'll try to get it in the same area that you are able to see in the video. So hopefully you guys can see this, but I'm just going to go to the database. And if this doesn't work, then I'll just edit this part out and fix it. But anyway, so you just want to zoom in to the area that you want to work in. We're in New Jersey, so I'm just going to go up here and look for my area of interest, and that's right here. And so already I see a red line that basically shows me where that coastline is going to be. There's other types of shorelines available that you might be able to get. I've not played with this too much, but I just want to grab a coastline for this area, so I can just download cusp by rectangle and then drag a mouse and get the area that I want. I can make it as big or little as I want, but everything inside of that will now be extracted and placed into a shapefile for me. So I'm saving this. It loads it into a zip file. And then you would just open that zip file and then pull in the data. So this is the data right here. So I've already got this stored on the file, on the folder. So let me just get out of this, and then I will come back in and load those files. So those files are under day 2, under shoreline. And what we can do is just grab this shape file and just bring it right in to SMS. And you can't really see it too much now, but if I turn off the map data, you can see this thin black line that basically is representing the shoreline that we downloaded for this area. And so it only goes part way, so you would need to substitute the rest of this some other method, whether it's adding it by hand or with the scatter contour and matching up the ends, something like that. But this will be pieces that you'll have to put together yourself. So one of the things that we'll do is to convert this shapefile over to a usable something that we can use. So we do that with convert shapes to feature objects, and we need to tell it where we're going to put it. So right now we need to make sure that it is in the activity classification coverage. Just leave that checked and then click next. And so it has a lot of information, as I mentioned in the presentation. We're not going to worry with any of this. We're just going to click finish and get the shape of the coastline added. And so what that's doing is going through and adding all of the shapes to the activity classification we already had. And so now in those areas we may have duplicates or areas that we need to get rid of. So this is another, as I said, process. So if you want to use this line instead of this one, then we can just get rid of the other pieces where they connect. So one of the things that we can do is to just remove the pieces that we don't want and make sure that the rest of it connect up. And so what we can do is I want to maybe select this vertex right here on this line and change it to a node. So this is now feature objects, vertices to nodes. It's now a node, and so this arc can be selected and it will not affect the rest of this. And so I can now delete that arc there. I'll turn off this shape here. And so I guess it was this point that I really wanted to get rid of. So let's remove that. And you see we have the shape from the coastline database here. We've got a gap, and we have the rest where we brought it in from our contours. And we can just connect that with the Create Arc tool. And I'll just connect this up and follow the shoreline. Double click on the end, and now we've got one long arc that basically represents everything we want. We would just keep doing that and move it from one place, removing the extras, and then making sure all of these arcs are connected together, as I just did with that creation arc. It doesn't matter that they're separate arcs, but what in the end we want is one big polygon that defines our area that we can use to say everything outside of this area is land. So as I said, we just want to make sure that we have one long shoreline. It's all connected together so that when we build a polygon, there are no gaps and we can get a consistent polygon. So what we can do, I know there's a lot here, but we've already processed this for you. We've already gone through a lot of this merging and interacting. So what I'm going to do now is to just pull in a saved solution from previous. And so I'm just going to change into the after coastline directory and bring in this new project and just choose to delete everything else. And that way we've previously done the work. We're still approximately at the same step, so I can move on for the for this webinar. So we've cleaned this up. We've got one arc for this entire area, but we don't have any polygons. And so polygons are basically created by arcs that close on themselves. And so we see this coastline is not closed. We need to do that. So what we can do is make sure we're in activity classification coverage and choose to create another arc. And so we could play around with some point in here, but just as easy, just select this endpoint and then move to the back and then select the other endpoint over here. Double click when you're finished, and if you get close to an existing node or vertex, then SMS will try to link directly to that so you don't have this small tolerances where you may not have actually clicked. So what we need to check now is to make sure that this back area is totally outside of our area for our domain. And it's hard to see them together. Actually, let me go in and turn on this inactive coverage. And so we see that this line does kind of cover a little bit on both sides of the polygon for the activity classification. So I need to widen this a little bit. So let me go back to activity. I'll choose to move the vertices, select it, and then I can move it out a little bit. It doesn't have to be exact, it just needs to be beyond the domain for the grid. So I'll go back, and it looks like it's okay now. So we have that set. So now with that done, what we can do is go back into our activity classification and tell SMS to build these arcs, create them, or use them to create polygons. And to do that, it's under Feature Objects, Build Polygons. And it looks like it didn't really do anything. But if you look over here, now there is a Select Feature Polygon tool that was grayed out a while ago. So we can choose that and then select this polygon that we created. And we can either right-click and choose attributes or double-click on it and tell it what classification this zone is going to be. So this is all outside of where we want. So we're just going to choose inactive or land and choose OK. And then we'll come in and we'll do the same thing for this one, make sure it's inactive. And there's a small little island, we'll do the same thing. If I wanted to do this and choose this as active instead of not defining it whatsoever, I could do that, but I can't do that right now because there are no polygons there. We have not selected and created another polygon on this side, and so we're just going to leave that alone. But if you try to select this polygon, that's the reason why it's not there, because we have not closed off this side, which goes through the inlet with a polygon. So the next thing we're going to do, now that we have our land water interface pretty much defined, is to go over how do we set up boundary conditions. And so that's under boundary conditions, so I'll select it here. We have the option to create arcs. We have the option to create points. For us in CMS, points really don't do anything at the present time. So we want to make sure that we choose an arc to represent the cell strings where we will be forcing our different components. So I went over a few of these in the presentation, and I'll do the same thing here. And so what I can do is to create a cell string or a feature arc for my offshore edge. And so I'm not going to select it, close it all the way. I'm just going to have it just outside of where my shoreline is. I don't really know because I can't see my grid frame where it is. So I'm just going to move it out here for now, and then you see how I kind of try to snap to that node. I'm just going to end this right here. We may play around with that a little bit. And so you see that it's created and it's defined as unassigned. So let me look at the Quadtree generator and see where this thing is. I'm way out there. So we don't have to do this, but I want to get it pretty close just in case. So one thing that you could do, since the grid frame does not show up in other coverages, is you could actually create within this Quadtree generator an arc that basically tells you where your edge is. And then you can see it when we get and start defining our boundary conditions. That's one way to kind of take away some of the mystery of where the edge of that Quadtree grid frame is located. And so I'm just going to select vertices. I choose this one, and I'm going to bring this one in a little bit closer to that line. Same thing for this one. It doesn't have to be exact. And then when I look at my Quadtree grid frame again, it looks better. So I'm going to get rid of that other unused arc in the grid frame Quadtree generator for right now, and go back to boundary conditions. So right now I've got a boundary condition where I'm going to be forcing my water surface elevation. So that's the ocean side. So I can double click this and come in, or I can right click. You have to be selecting use the right tool to select the arc, but then just come in and assign boundary conditions and choose what type you want. This is water surface elevation. We're going to be using, there's all the different options. We're going to be using a curve. And that curve, we can specify values here if we wanted. We could open Excel, bring in cut and paste some values. But I'm going to just import a file that I already have. It's in this grid creation, water level forcing XYZ file. Already has all the data. So here it is. It looks right. If you wanted, we could zoom in and look at pieces of this, or then you could frame that again and look at the whole thing. But once you're satisfied, just click OK. It shows up here, and you're ready to go. There's nothing else really that we need to change. And so I will click OK. So once we do that, it still says unassigned, but once we click off of it, it's going to change. And you see it almost disappeared. That's because the water surface elevation forcing color for this arc matches pretty closely with my bathymetry colors. And so I could either change my range for bathymetry or just kind of look out for this arc myself. But one thing you could do is go under display options, and then for the arc boundary conditions, you see there's some options here, and we could actually change the color. So I'll just change the line color to purple, and hopefully it will be a little bit more visible. So once we do this, oh, there it goes, and we can see that now. So that's one way to see it a little bit better. So in the presentation, I went over a couple of other boundary condition types, and one of those is a river. And so say this is a river boundary. We're not going to do this as such for this particular project, But if this was a river and we wanted to specify that, hey, this is where water is flowing into the domain, I need to specify some values here. And so what I need to do is create an arc that represents that flow. And so I will just choose that right there. It needs to be relatively close to the land-water interface. Since it's inside the domain and not on the edge, SMS needs to know where it's going to be. And we can't force it too far back because it really needs to know what cells in this where it's defining the land-water, which cells to use. There's a way we can see that later on, and I'll go into that. But for now, let's just keep it as it is. So once we have this defined, we can select it and then choose to assign boundary conditions. In this case, since it's a river flow, we would go into flow rate forcing and then choose some different options. And so the source here now are only constant and curve. We're going to choose a curve, and then we can specify values. So time in hours, and then the values are meters cubed per second. And this is a total meters cubed per second along the entire cell string, or that entire boundary condition, and not per cell like it was in previous versions of CMS and SMS. When we were defining this previously, we had to actually create the cell string, so we knew ahead of time how many cells were needed to represent that river flow. And so we could get this value, but now we just know there's a certain amount of flow along that entire boundary. So that's one thing you need to make sure you do. All right, you just click OK, and then you're ready to go, just like we did before. You notice I'm using 1308. You guys probably only have 1305. If you're viewing this later, you may have a later version, but right now I am working with 1308, and so I do have the option to turn on or off this inflow direction for the flow rate. That was an issue before where it was always setting the inflow boundary or inflow direction to 0, and then on this west side it was trying to force the river flow as soon as it got into the domain towards the south, and so we had to change that. So normally this is unchecked unless you absolutely need it. You just click OK, and then this would switch to a flow rate boundary condition. I didn't do anything, so it's not going to change. One of the other types is tidal constituents. So you wouldn't do that on a river side. I'm going to go ahead and delete that. You would want to set that on the ocean side where you would actually have tides. And so it's still water surface elevation forcing, but the source would be either harmonic or tidal constituent. And then there's also an option for tidal database. We're not going to go over that now. We can go over it in a future webinar. But for tidal constituents, basically you have to tell it, okay, I'm going to be working with X number of constituents, and these are the names. And we have a long list of names, 27 or so, I think. And so we can specify each one of these that we're actually going to be using. And so you would look at the tide tables in your area and choose values here that make sense. So you're giving for every individual area. You should be given some amplitudes and phases. Those amplitudes, if they're tiny, they have no or negligible contribution, and so you really don't need to specify them. If they have a significant amplitude, say 0.2 meters or 0.1 meters or above, then you might think about including it. Just make sure you get the ones that you need and are actually going to change anything. And you would just add those values to the amplitudes and phases right here, and then click OK. And then you're ready to go. I'm just going to leave this right now with the other type of forcing that we already had for water levels, and then we would be good to go. And so that's it. That's all you would really need for your boundary conditions. And so now we're able to move on. So now would probably be a good chance or point to go ahead and save your grid. I mean, not grid, but save your project so you don't lose all the stuff that we've already done. I've already got this saved at a spot. So if you look, there's a folder called called After Boundary, that if you are at this point, your grid's not really looking like you want it, then you might want to load that and catch up. So what we're going to do now is go into working again with the Quadtree generator. We defined the domain, but we did not define all the resolution zones that we may need. And so what we're going to do is go in and add these different zones. Let me give you a little bit of information. Right now, the Quadtree generator coverage, all it has in it is this grid frame. There are this arc that you see here defining the shoreline and the extents of the bay, that is not in this particular coverage. One of the things that would be great is if I could maybe merge these two together. So I have this line from the activity and I have my grid frame from the generator, and I would want to merge those. But when I try to do that, there's a bug in the merge procedure where the Quadtree generator does not get added to the merged coverage. And so we can't really use that right now. And so what I'm going to do instead of that is to just take the activity classification coverage, you see it now in black, and duplicate that. So I'll right click and duplicate it, and it's here. You see they're all the same, arcs are all set in there. And so what we need to do is, this is going to now become a Quadtree generator. And so we need to change the type. And so the other thing that it doesn't have now that it did before was that grid frame. And so I need to create a new grid frame. And I showed you earlier, you can just click this out, three points, then select it, and then enter those values again so that we get the same dimensions that we had in our other coverage. And so I'm going to pull that up real quick and enter those values. So 186, 200, 145, 780, 347, 7630, and 11100. And so there we have our grid frame. So now we have a starting place for our areas of resolution, and we also have the grid frame. So I can get rid of this old Quadtree generator. So I'm just going to delete that. And I'm going to rename this one so that I can tell them apart. All right. And so we still have our three different coverages that we need. But now we have a place to start for our areas of resolution. And so things to consider as we are adding resolution to areas are basically structures. That would be jetties and breakwaters and groins and things like that. You really need some resolution to define the flow around these structures. And so that's one area to consider. There's also the amount of flow that's coming in and out of your channel. You may need adequate resolution to really represent that. And so what we generally recommend is about 10 cells across your channel. So what you can do is, okay, here's our main channel. So maybe this is the narrowest part of this main channel. And what I can do is come in, and there's this tool for measuring. And then I can just click one side, click the other, and see that this is about 67 meters across. And so for me to get 10 cells across that width, I need the total resolution to be 5 meters or greater. So say 6.7 would give me exactly 10 across there. So I'm just going to be round numbers, I'm going to use 5 meters for this area. So let me just show you how to start. We have the Quadtree Generator, and we want to create a new arc. And so we have an existing arc with the coastline, and I just want to pick a point, so I'm just going to pick one and just draw a little area where we want to add resolution. So I'm making it a little bit semicircular. You would want this area to really encompass your ebb shoal, your ebb jet, that type of thing. So if the shape needed to change to represent that, then you would need to make sure that that's done correctly. And for right now, this is fine. This is just an arc. It's not a polygon because this is all open inside of here. And so typically we might have a couple of zones where we would increase again on the outside of this. I'm going really quickly, and so it might not be the best, but just for demonstration purposes, I'm going to keep doing this like I'm going right now. We also see back here, we see these tidal flat areas. We've got the bathymetry and defined, and so what we could do is to define the channels inside of here. And so I'll just outline where this tidal flat area is. I'll just go real quick and then move on to another section here for this one. Oops, I didn't connect it. There we go. And then I'll do one more up here. And you would just keep adding the areas that you would want. So we have a constriction right here. If we really wanted this open, of course we need a little bit better bathymetry because you see how jagged this is. So we would need better resolution here in the bathymetry. But we would add, a zone here to increase the resolution, say in this area. And so this would all become one polygon, and we could define the resolution for that area. So I'm just going to add a couple more lines through here to kind of define these areas. And then the next step would be to go under feature objects and build polygons. And so now there's this tool, and I can click the different zones where I will have resolution. And so I may actually, now that I'm seeing this one, I probably need to modify it a little bit. And so I will do that real quick. That should be fine. So what we would do is for the various areas. So this one I said I wanted to have be 5 meters. So I can double click here, check the box and say this is going to be 5 meters. And this next one, since it's right next to this one, shouldn't be more than double that amount. That's just the way resolution works. And so this should be 10 meters. And the same for this. So this is 5, and we'll go and then make this one 10. And we'll make these 20. Oops. And you may have another one. Let's create another one real quick inside of here, because this is a really flat area. Rebuild my polygons and set this outer area to be 20, but this inner area to be 40. All right, and so this is just a general, okay, so I'll do the same thing through here, and I'll make this 5. I'm not sure what it would be. It probably needs to be more than that. So the next step, once you have all this, is to basically create a grid. So you right click on the Quadtree Generator. You may want to save your project first, so save either in the same spot or save as a new name, something like that. Once you're ready, then you can just come in here for the Quadtree Generator, convert and map to Quadtree grid. You see all of this is the same. We have a minimum cell size of 5. We have a maximum of 10 right now, so we actually need to make this larger. Let's make this 160 meters. And basically this is defining what the largest cell size will be out, oops, I went ahead and did it, out in these areas. So you can see where this largest cell size is. And then as it needs to, it goes down and down until you get to the areas where you have specified for a certain resolution. All right, and so you see these areas. If we look at the individual cells, we see at the bottom here that the area is 1600, so that's 40 by 40. So we know that's about the same. That's about right. So this is 400, that's 20 by 20. So anyway, we're good to go. And this is how you create your grid. So you would iterate on this process until you have a grid that you felt was adequate and represented the processes that you needed to address. So just really quick, I'm going to load in the final grid that we've used in the past. So I have a final resolution folder just so you can see what that particular grid looks like when it's created and what the resolution zones look like, and I'll go into that real quick. So that's Quadtree Generator. I'll turn those on. I'll turn the other ones off real quick. And you see all of these different zones. We have some specified right around where the groins are. We have a certain size here for around the jetties, and those are 2.5 meters. And other areas out here are 5 meters. And the next zone out is 10 meters. So you see what I'm talking about, increasing in zones in different areas. We have that as 5, this is 10, and here again it's 2.5 with a smaller area of 5 right outside. So you just add in the areas that you need, and then you're ready to go. You can right click, convert to Quadtree grid, make sure everything is how you want it. One thing I mentioned in the presentation is this adjust button. So if you don't know what the base cell size is and you just put a number out here, that's not really an even multiple of 2.5 meters. So you want to make sure exactly what's going on. And so you could click this adjust button and it goes to the next size up. I thought it was next size down. So if I entered instead 150 and then adjusted, it should get me to that 160 value. That is a multiple of 2.5 meters. So the next thing is the depth. We can choose a scatter set. I'll load, or I'll choose which one, and we've only got one to choose from, so there's interpolate from that one, and we use interpolation. There's different types. Linear is pretty quick and usually pretty good. Extrapolation, if we had parts of our grid outside of where we had bathymetry, then we would want to specify that. But we are okay, so I'm okay with just leaving this as 0. And just click OK. You see the Z shows up there, and then we can click OK, and it will end up creating a grid according to these zones of resolution. And so this is it. So let me turn off my scatter, and I see the contours from my grid. I'll turn off my map modules, so all of these will kind of disappear, and then I can turn on the cell edges and see what this looks like. And so we have areas of increased resolution in channels, and where it's flat and shallower, we've increased the resolution to where we don't really need a lot of cells to represent what's going on up there. We've increased in a few places where we need it, like these areas of constriction and areas of the groins and around the jetties. This is all land, so we didn't really need to increase right here. So this is the grid. So there you go. From here, you would want to save your project, and then we will be picking up from here on tomorrow and actually using all of this to create a simulation and then to actually run and launch CMS Flow. So I hope you enjoyed it. If there are any questions, let us know. And until next time, have a good day.